All right. So I'll try to be actually under 5 minutes with this. So the nature of obligation, and that is like mandated action um, inside an organization, and how to design towards such needs, and of course, like as an introduction, by mandated action, I mean like a common expectation of an organizational structure is that somebody can order somebody else to do something, like, and or some structure can also order. Like there's a decision body. The decision body decides that we will next develop this, and then we have graphic designer that now a new task for you. Here's what you can do. And there can be all kind of softness to this, but the basic paradigm of that. I would even say that when people talk about horizontal organizations, the only thing is they do is they look at this sort of order as a dial and turn it to 0. But it's still the same paradigm. It's like now the order structure doesn't exist in itself. But two things on this. I think there are other relations than orders. Like, to make a really simple example, if I think of an offer, the conventional one, like you can buy this type of thing, it's actually not an order relation at all. It's well, I would call it an offer relation. But the key thing there is that the offer defines a potential thing that has not happened yet. That is a transaction. Then it actually also functions by rights, by giving them towards this. Like, for example, in buy this, it might be anybody can come in, but they have to have, say, €5 and put them in. And then the offer turns from potential to actual and fulfills itself. But that's a relation, but it's a potential relation. But the potential relation is just as defined as an actual relation because it tells what happens if it happens. And then therefore can create relations just like orders. I think the space actually has more, but that's maybe good for now. But how does this relate then to obligation and obligation relations? Well, two things. Well, first of all, to underline from that, thinking in other modes or styles of relation from order to offer is one way to start to look at how do we kind of conceive spaces that are almost like obligation bound, or bound in this language of creating mandates to actually structures that are more about volition, choice. And of course, this is nothing new. We can see this in many, many organizations in some ways, but once you have it in kind of design thinking, that you can flip the switch or flip the perspective, it helps you to think, because also mandated relations are sometimes useful. But secondarily, I think beyond that, I think it's essentially impossible to design towards an actual obligation. And what I mean by that, let's make it practical, is like somebody is given the task of producing, say, new graphics in 2 weeks. What the system can do is within it say, okay, this person has now this task in itself, but can this order in any way assure that this thing will happen? No, it's actually outside the system because it's based on an external agent, the person. And it might be that they, I don't know, have a bad week or burnout or whatever, and the thing doesn't come. So in this sense, actually kind of thinking of obligation as a root concept, I think is awkward and unfruitful from the design side. Because there is another way of looking at them. And this is essentially looking at conditions. And that is something that can be inside the system. So if we say, if in this slot, a graphic design does not appear in 2 weeks, this and this happens. Like it might like create a query to the whoever is responsible, whatever that happens. There's a lot of choice there, but the key point here is it's actually not putting the obligation first. It's thinking about how does the system wants to react first. And once again, this is really nothing new. There is retributions, whatever, but it's as a design side thing, it's a really useful flip because like obligations are almost like banging your head to the wall. You're just saying, just let's all behave, but that's not doing anything effective. And it's whereas if you're thinking like, okay, what kind of conditions we put, the things that we want, do we put different conditions to things that are critical and versus some things that are not critical? We are actually back to the design space, back to the space that we can express, back to the space that we can utilize for the design of organization. And there could be a lot to say about this, but I'll just open that there. So this sort of mode of relations and how culture is order-based, the dial of order. Oh, Eric raised his hand and dropped. I think that was a technical problem, but anybody else can go ahead.
He wrote in the chat that yeah, he had to go.
Oh, that was
yeah.
Another convention.
Yeah. I have to run as well.
Yeah.
See you.
All right. See you. So anybody?
I'm just like curious about if there's if it is productive even to think about things that sort of happen outside of the conventions, like flipping the board. You know, you're playing a game and someone gets so angry that they decide to flip the board, violently end the game. That is, of course, not modeled into the rules of the game, right? But there is a space for that to happen.
Yeah.
Is that useful to think about in modeling? In modeling organizations and seeing organizations through the lens of games. What do you think?
I think it's a judgment question. That I think it's always good to kind of map out that space and then think about what kind of things you want to model, what kind of things you want to put conditions on. Like, for example, it comes to this sort of maybe two questions: criticality, like how essential it is for the structure, and then likelihood, probability. Like the flipping a table is usually not. It's probably more like a probability question. Like coding it in means that people would have to take in more rules, which takes energy process. And it happens so rarely that you can easily think that let's not code that in. Whereas like inside an organization, like even in a normal offer, if there's no payment, there is usually a condition structure, like unless it's crypto. But generally, and the reason for that is there is a probability it can happen, and it's essential. Therefore, the structure is put there. So this is the judgment question. Like you cannot design for every situation, but on the other hand, you probably want to design for certain situations. But you're once again in this space you can design, unlike the obligation. You're something that in somewhere that you can address. Any other comments, questions? Yeah.
That's comment. Yeah, it reminds me kind of the distinction between offer-based or yeah, and kind of the what was the word? It just slipped my mind. Order. Yeah, it really reminds me the distinctions between the promise and imposition in the promise theory, and it's, I think I would like to explore that more. Like, what's the actual analogies or where there might be differences? Because I'm finding the promise theory is a pretty interesting analytical framework to think and reason about systems. So yeah, at least for me, it would be interesting to explore at some point.
Yeah, it's a nerdy topic and probably not known for some of the others, but just very shortly, promise theory is interesting. If one starts to look at differences, just as a kind of put a road sign rather than walk all the way there. Promise exists as an actuality. And what is interesting about an offer, even a traditional one, is that it actually kind of utilizes the potential versus actual and kind of codifies something as that is not read as happening yet, and maybe not happening ever. And through this route, you could actually go, why does even economy as we know it exist? Because our economy is actually not completely based, certainly, because it uses governance, which is more like order-based organization design. But like economy is highly dependent on offer relations for its designs, like all the buying and selling, for example, and even other things. And those are once again dependent on this being able to create not only actual space, which is in effect, but also potential space. And this is not to say that order offer is better, because I do think actually just like the organization designs, like these kind of models to create them can be many. So I'm not kind of like this is better than promise theory. I think there's actually some good nuances to promise theory direction as well. But yeah, final point, why I also like the offer is that it starts from expression. That the order offer is thinking of something that usually is presented as some kind of an expression, even if it's like spoken out. And the expression range is something where we're back to kind of designable space. Whereas promise is, well, it can be coded, but usually it's kind of like an internal attitude in itself. Like, but in the order, you start to think, what is actually the offer? Sorry, in the offer, you think, what is actually the offer? Like, and what are the conditions here? And what kind of different design one could make there? So my two interests in making the division this way is to have a model, and this stems from a larger structural model that I've been developing in EXA. And that highly utilizes that in every situation you have this sort of analytic of seeing what is utilized as what is expressed as potential, what is defined as potential, and what is expressed and defined as actual, and how also potential has these conditions that can turn it into actual. And this is very much a way to bring economy and what we call governance into the same pool. Because once you have that possibility, potential and actual, once you have the order relations and offer relations, economy is on the same board. Because like I said, the economy needs the offer relation, it needs the potential to come to the same design space, same structural palette. And for these reasons, I find this sort of alternate or different take than promise theory useful.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks. I guess this could be an interesting discussion, but since probably a lot of people here are not that familiar with it, then it might be good to discuss it in some specific space, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Agreed. I think any comments on this or the earlier topics or some other topic would be welcome.
Yeah, sure. I'll just go back to the question of examples of organizations and how that fits into the design. So I can see, a way where, like point number 3, for example, like hacking a game. Like, can pick a game, hack it, see what happens. We can also, have a look at organizations that we like to support through any kind of, game artifacts or manifestations from this group. But I understand it can also be quite wider, right? It's not necessarily that we're, a DAO has to come out of this game structure, but at the same time, it's I guess interesting to think about a game that specifically supports that kind of structure versus other structures. And yeah, what you were just saying about the kind of layering of economy or capitalism and the kind of embeddedness of the organization within that, I think it's a very interesting in terms of yeah, what kind of layers here, it's not just, how do we survive within the system, it's how we're contributing to transformation maybe, etc. And all kinds of considerations that come into play that, yeah, also then arrange themselves in governance structures and rules and whatnot. Just that one, and I guess just one that's kind of an offshoot, but like, rules, games, common pool resources, like Ostrom kind of line. Maybe that's something interesting to think about in terms of the rules aspect, designing rules.
Yeah, I think you're completely right, and to your like what can we contribute to organization, and that as a design question, I would even add like how can the organization enable us, even kind of transform us, change us. Like, I mean, the concept of citizen, especially and the nations, have changed us as a behavior. And even if you get a job, to take a more like down to earth example, that will change you. And you might not be happy about it, you might be very happy about it, but the change is there. And the organization is one of the, not the only, but one of the key factors of designing, or where the design of this change can come as a possibility. But I also hear what you were saying, like the practical case. Let me share my screen, because I was thinking, have inverted colors, but maybe I'll change that to be normal. I mean, designer is also a graphic designer, so I respect his bright background. But I was thinking like, it's probably kind of outside of the bounds of this session that we get anywhere deep in game design. But what about this, like as a proposal? We could talk about whether you like it or not, if you have, is to have a hacking session next time. Because I guess I have this sort of, like I like to start from the abstract, but it's also like I probably talk too much in the abstract and kind of almost like keep it to abstract topics. So what if we kind of, for the next time, took a game and the whole session would be about hacking it, and towards the organization particularly. Once again, not optimal organization, etc., but rather looking at certain game mechanics, and like this, we could take an area here and think about what could that mean if it would be rather serving an organization in itself. And this would be my current proposal for such a game, partly because it's so easy to take in, but it also actually has some interesting designs. I would have maybe, I wouldn't have many other games, but they might be longer and harder to take in. So this kind of short game would be a good example. But also because of the reason that, I mean, the topic might seem wacky and outside of the realm of organization, but to take a very known quality in board games, is the board games are often designed first as systems, and then somebody comes in and always slaps a dungeon on it because that sells better. But the game might start that now it's a game of Egyptian pyramid building, and then ultimately become a dungeon delving or a dungeon building maybe, because there is a kind of interchangeability, not pure, but still like between structures and what is the skin. It's often called skin, actually, like you can reskin things, so to speak. So even though, yes, it's spaceships and Star Trek style things, but what these structures could be if they're reskinned towards building an organization rather than a spaceship. And that's actually kind of my starting point why this is interesting. This in here you create characters, and then you create a ship. That actually kind of tracks quite nicely to members and organization. Because the ship here is like the Star Trek ship, which is kind of the organization they're in. Finally, as a kind of interesting experimental direction, there is a kind of like, there's the adventure concept. Well, adventure, you could say, is the project. One adventure being one project. They're actually kind of like, in terms of their relation to what's the context. Characters are persons, ship is what surrounds everybody, adventure is a process. Like that there is actually a lot of overlap, structurally speaking, once we kind of shed away some of the skin. And this can create kind of interesting possibilities in itself. So that's one case we could hack, but I think we could open it up, especially if we have it later, whether it's next week or like on some set time, that people could propose games and maybe like bring other options if they want towards which game we could hack. But how does that sound to you, like as a context of processing?
I like the idea. I've never played seriously played a role-playing game, but I would be very happy to try it for sure.
Well, if you've been in an organization, then you know how to role play. Yeah, but it's also like I think we can hack, and there's a technique called Playstorming, which I was supposed to mention last time, but didn't get to it. So Playstorming is quite a useful thing. For me, it's different from game storming, by the way. Also, that concept exists, but Playstorming it's very small, it's very new. But the key thing is like you can start playing something like when you have a first rule, and then imagine what are the other rules around it. So you step into the game even if you have like one structure. It's like you would step into a house when you have one rule, and then you start kind of, you can propose while you're playing on a sort of meta level, like what if the next room would be this, or what if the other rule would be this, and then you can try that and skip that, like throw that rule away or modify it or keep it. But it actually works quite well, and there are some designers that design by Playstorming. That of course there's play testing, but play testing is usually that you have like a beta version of some kind of a full game. In Playstorming you don't have to. You might have just some core mechanic like oh, you're this and this kind of characters, but I don't know what the decision loop is. And then like you make the characters, and then somebody else proposes, well, if we try this sort of loop of what happens, let's see how it plays, things like this. So we could utilize that. Like I think it's good to start from the kind of design side, because it also, I think it's a good way to be less abstract and less theoretical and turn this into practice. Is like, what are the, let's say, the differences in emphasis when you're thinking towards organization and when you're thinking towards game, but also how you can maybe leave some traces of one side to teach the other. And like for example, like in the game testing towards organizations I've been doing, what has been interesting that there's really interesting quality if you can do an organization in, say, in 20 minutes. Like you create this sort of like a playable piece, and how that kind of could point out this sort of like having an organization for a couple of days, which can maybe then continue, and how that can be interesting in itself. And that's a kind of quality that you can get from many games. But yeah, like how does it sound like to have a like for others, like the hacking session plus everybody can propose games towards it?
I myself am not going to propose a game likely, but I'm happy to hack away on anyone else's proposal. Yeah, sounds like fun. And let's get into doing stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's good to pick anyway one game, but like we can choose what the game is. Like let's just bring the proposals in and whatever works. Like this can be a backup or along the palette of choices, but it's good to start from one. So you don't have to propose a game to join in. And I think it's good to do together, precisely that it's kind of looking at these issues and making decisions together, like how to do this and that and so on. But yeah, I think that having a hacking session, I mean, this has been a couple of sessions of which are more theoretical, although I kind of appeal to the thing that the first session was asked for elements of game organization design, which kind of generally veers to somewhat structural and abstract in itself, and this was sort of a continuation of that. But I'd be really happy to kind of go to more design space, because also design space can produce outputs, like even if there are kind of some alpha sketches, and those might be interesting to even put out. I think this, I mean, you can agree or disagree, but I think if the group could put out things that are sometimes quite hacky and weird and experimental, it can label them, this is an experimental, or hey, this weird structure kind of points out to a way to organize people that is quite different from the norm, and therefore it's valuable in itself, although we don't know what to do with it. Like, we don't know what would be its kind of a good use case. That can be, in terms of culture and structural mapping out, quite useful.
That sounds great. That sounds really cool. I also, I thought maybe, I don't know if this is something you've done, probably, but like, I'm thinking here in the context of video games particularly, like analyzing some game mechanics, dissecting them in a way that's useful to think of them in the context of organizations.
Yes.
And maybe do some mapping there. Would that be like a useful activity? That's a place where I have some experience. Like, I watch a lot of theory on video games, so that could be also interesting.
I agree, and I would kind of support that. But how about others? Is that like a useful perspective?
Sure. Yeah.
I think like we can be kind of game agnostic. Like, you can bring a video game, you can bring a board game, role-playing game, or whatever game poem. Jakub?
And perhaps this might be an offer from my side, because I'm playing with a game engine, like a simple game engine in Rust, and kind of I want to be implementing simple complementary currency interactive like visualizations. And so perhaps we could use that at some point to like visualize some of the thingies. So I'd be happy to.
Definitely.
To bring this.
And there are other people kind of around this that are also interested in kind of creating more economical approaches in the game context, like starting from a game, but kind of bringing economy in. So that's a good topic to bring. It might bring certain people also more into the process. But okay, so that for me, like given that we're generally in this sort of hour-ish timescale, I could kind of like leave this as a as the kind of start for the next time, and then take that as a topic, and then the choice of games could run through the week. Let's use the Telegram. Like, if somebody has other proposals, like you can put it there, and we can just collect them in. I'll put this as a starter, as a link. It's freely available. Also a good link. John Hopper is a good designer generally. Like, he has some other games that are useful to look at. He's very like, from the role-playing side, he's quite structurally diligent, like in like how he designs, and capable. So yeah, for example, this is actually kind of a neat structure itself, and has a lot of history. Actually, you can read the thanks list in this game. They're only first names, but if you know which games this loans, you can see like Ron is actually Ron Edwards, because this has a similar one value mechanic than Ron Edwards' game Troll Babe, and then Vincent is Vincent Baker. Ben is Ben Lehman, because it takes probably from the whatever it's called, Extreme Street Luge, and so like it's loaning actually a lot of mechanics in itself. But yeah, like and they can also be like the proposals can also be video games. like especially if they're kind of like experienceable through videos. I'll actually put like one, maybe a couple of games that might be interesting to see, even if they're not necessarily immediate design candidates. This sort of, there's an interesting writing game, but I think it can be think of as a game, but also certainly an organization that that is available on Steam, but I think it costs like $3-4. But I think it might be an interesting case to for those who are interested. Anyway, let's take last comments and like any wishes also beyond this context. Once again, I've talked too much, but I try to learn to talk less. And maybe we can try to develop new rules of how to extract from more questions from you, more comments from you. Also that side of things. But yeah, like any wishes at the end or any last comments.
I guess perhaps this is something you already intended the last time with the board, but I think perhaps if we had some kind of board where we could collaboratively define or kind of capture the concepts and perhaps their relations, that could be something, yeah, that might be useful. But
I agree. The thing, like the one idea is that like fairly soon is there would be a kind of very early version of like some of these concepts expressed as text first, like maybe in this sort of modular fashion, like nothing fancy, but like a little bit of pieces. But putting them in a board is a sensible thing. Like it's like almost like two representations, like the board could show relations, etc. And I think from the key thing towards this is what would be a like good platform for that. Like if somebody has any candidates, like I know some of them, but all of them are a little bit wonky. Like I just thought about the text, and I'm still like very reluctantly thinking that Google Docs is the easiest one just for everybody to access and so on. But like if somebody has any proposals of what such a board could be now or later, like we could think about that, or like make those proposals also now, if such exist.
I support the idea of the board. I think Mido works well enough, probably.
Can you put the link in the Telegram? Like nothing else needed. Like a possible board platform, like that would be. And I think it's good that they become collected, because then somebody else who is not here might actually see like and comment and things like this. That's always useful. So, but yeah, like so we can start from there. But I do think actually this combination of like I'm getting there, but I think it's fairly soon we could have this sort of document set open and kind of utilize. We can also create some interesting rules for it, like but it would be open to everybody to write in at the outset, of course, and that we can have some basic concepts, but then people can add like experimental concepts they've been thinking about, that there would be still space for that. But then unless there is a really good field that also kind of presents text well, it might be useful to have like a text form and a field form. And I do think they can still, I don't know, nicely collaborate, even if they're different platforms, because, you know, you can use the titles or something like titles with even pictures in the kind of board form, and then have the text in a link, which you can then have in a text form, in a text document. So let's do that, and let's aim towards that document. Maybe I'll try to open it in a few days and put whatever I have at that point, which might be unfinished, but who the fuck cares? And then put a link that is like an editing link, which probably means that it's a Google Doc. If there's somebody who absolutely does not use Google Docs, you can react. But like, I mean, I made a new round of looking at, and the point is like, there are better platforms, but they're usually like easily hit a cost limit, which is then per user, which is very hard in inclusive structures. So yeah, so like I'll start it this week over the weekend, and then open it up for everybody, and we can play with the rules of adding there, but generally they should be something that is inclusive in nature, and we can kind of change those rules as things go. It doesn't have to be something finalized at this point. But it might be an interesting way to create to come to a point that the group actually expresses things and becomes has a speaking voice, so to speak.
And I'll need to jump off now. So thank you very much for
the
inspiring meeting.
I think we're finishing, and let's actually finish unless somebody really has something to add, but I'll give 3 seconds for that. Okay. Therefore,
see you next week.
Thanks everybody, and see you next week.
Bye.
Yep, bye.
Yeah.